EVPA Transformative Finance Deep Dive around the topic of collaboration and how we can strengthen our internal capacity for collaboration. My name is Anja König. I lead Transformative Finance at EVPA. I'm here with my colleague Isabel, who supports our community work in Transformative Finance, as well, of course, our co-hosts of TPI, who I will introduce in a minute, and our special guests as well. Also, we will be joined by some of my colleagues at EVPA. Carolina, I saw her. There will be Alessia, who's the head of community engagement and research. Sophie from the corporate initiative. So in case you see them, you know who is around. Talking about who is around, I suggest that you put your name in your profile and the organization so that we know where you're calling from, and maybe also add it to the chat, the name of your organization, and maybe you want to say also where you're calling from and why are you here in this call with us today. So at EVPA, we're hosting the deep dive format to allow our members really to dive deeper into certain areas of interest and to really be able to exchange and connect with other members in a safe environment. So the topic of collaboration and leadership and capacity for inner leadership is also critical to any of the transformative finance interventions. So some of you participated in the Collab Award last year, and most of you who made a submission actually said collaboration was the most important area or system practice, how we call them. So I would like to just take a few minutes to share a little bit how the topic of collaboration fits within the transformative finance work that we do at EVPA and how this relates to this. So we've been supporting the topic connection learning around transformative finance and system practices since 2019. We had system change topic at EVPA's annual conference since 2019. We hosted e-talks, deep dives in 2020. And as I said earlier, many of you participated in the Collab Award, for which we also organized a couple of meetups. And there was a lot of energy around and willingness really to share and engage with the EVPA community at a deeper level. So we heard your call. We may have another Collab Award this year, but also we are currently designing a transformative finance lab, and I will share a little bit more about this just in a second. But before that, just to really frame a little bit and why we believe it's important to engage in transformative finance and why we feel this work is really incredibly important. If you go to the next slide, Isabel. The topic of transformative finance is really because we believe we really need to rethink the way we do finance and go about finance in view of the big questions of our time. We believe that currently there's a bit of a disconnect between the way we do finance and the sheer size of the societal challenges that we try to address. Also, we know that if you go to the next slide, Isabel, we know that the complexity of the societal challenges and the volatility and uncertainty around them really require us to go a little bit deeper and address the problems at their roots. And if we really want to go deeper and address the problems at their roots, then we also require a different kind of leadership capacities. Isabel, if you can just move to the next and the next one again. So we do find that these kind of investment practice and leadership methods, they are a bit different compared to our linear way of engaging and intervening. And for that reason, we interviewed and spoke with a number of you, a number of our members, but also experts in system practices and transformative finance to really find out, when do you use system practices, and what kind of system practices are you actually using? And there we came up with these frameworks on first one on really on the common use cases, where you can really see that there are different kind of use cases that we observed in the VPA community, starting from public-private collaboration for social innovation to place-based funding and investment strategies for to transforming and intervening in value chains and across value chains. We looked at examples of open social innovation, really interesting and impressive how this has been done. And we have some members who are actually engaging and are courageous enough to saying it's not enough that we only intervene for societal challenge, to address a specific societal challenge, but we really want to transform the way how we go about finance, how we go about entrepreneurship, about impact entrepreneurship. We want to transform our social innovation ecosystems. Related to that, we observed also that we find a lot of blending going on and pooling of resources across the spectrum of capital. And that is for us another use case that we observed. So if we look at the different system practices, we can see that there are 5 broad areas of system practices that are being used. One is the really important area of system diagnostics. So this includes all system awareness and how do you find out what's happening around you and the dynamics of that system where you try to intervene. That has obvious implications on how you design your system change, investment and funding strategy. We also realize that there's a lot around learning. How do you actually evaluate system interventions? And how do you measure the impact if you intervene at the system level? And that interestingly relates very much to the management of your investments, as well as also your own learning culture. And that way also it cuts across the inner leadership and governance and culture things that we're also going to discuss today. And of course, there's this whole range of collaboration practices, because collaboration is really fundamental to most of the system practices. So we are specifically going to look at collaboration practices and the leadership capacities, the inner work, the capacity of the intervening organization, the investor in system change and transformation today. But I mentioned earlier that we are looking at different frameworks. So we developed this framework for the Collab Award last year. And this year we started designing a transformative finance lab. And I just want to at least mention a little bit what this is all about, because collaboration here is also fundamental. So the transformative finance lab is really about overcoming the disconnects in the impact finance ecosystem to be able to really effectively address wicked systemic challenges. And what we are recommending would be to, and what we like to promote is to apply proven innovation system methods that allow for the co-creation of systemic solutions of a larger group of multi-stakeholder communities. And if you go to the next slide, just to give you a little bit of an impression what we have in mind with this lab, it would be in 3 different modules, and it combines elements of future thinking, of foresight with system practices, system mapping, as well as ideation and prototyping methodologies, so that we really use this lab process to get to a real result. So we hope we can start this lab anytime soon on specific topics. So if this resonates with us, let us know. But without further ado, I would now like to ask you and get a little bit of a feedback. And I think we can just stop the presentation here, Isabel, because we really want to also see each other.
So thank you. So Anya, thank you. You gave a brief introduction on the Partnering Initiative. So for those of you who don't know us, we were established around 20 years ago as part of a collaboration between the University of Cambridge and the International Business Leaders Forum. And then we split off and became our own entity. And we work across all different societal sectors trying to push multi-stakeholder partnering. We work at the policy level, trying to create a favourable environment for multi-stakeholder partnering, but we also work a lot with individual institutions who are trying to enhance their partnering practices. And something we started to see as we were working with NGOs, with private sector, with UN, and increasingly with philanthropic foundations and funders, and seeing more and more interest in them, in how they can take a partnering approach, both with their grantees or investees, and also encouraging partnership between their grantees and investees. And that was really, really important, particularly when there is an ambition for systems change. So this led us to develop a strategic program around partnering for philanthropic impact. And during the inquiry phase of that program, we worked very closely with Johnson & Johnson Foundation, and we have a guest from J&J here today, and also with the Z Zurich Foundation. And through this inquiry phase, we identified a range of different strategies, partnering strategies, that funders could adopt. So if we can just go to the next slide, I will talk you through this framework. We have these 4 different models, but they are intersecting. Each one builds on the last. And also just to note that this was created with philanthropic foundations in mind, but we think it can apply to other funders and those working in the impact investment space, and we welcome your comments on that today. So I'll just briefly talk you through the model. On the far left of this kind of spectrum, we have the trusted partner model, and this is about moving away from transactional project-based short-term funding for grantees or investees and moving to a longer term, perhaps covering core funding and including other support. So for example, the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network, together with Google, has just launched the Asia Pacific Sustainability Seed Fund, which, as well as providing cash grants for the non-profit grantees, Google technology and expertise will also be provided. Then moving on to the connector model, this is moving away from bilateral relationships and actually looking at how different grantees or investees can work together, and being quite deliberate and purposeful about that, which might involve creating specific networks or coalitions, or potentially funding a specific partnership project between investees. So I saw in one of the CoLab awardees, the Accenture Foundation, working on a job seekers program that brought together 2 of their non-profit partners, as well as providing that additional technical support from Accenture and its various tech partners. So these first 2 models are mainly about working with grantees, investees, typically when we created this with NGOs and civil society in mind. But actually, when we're thinking about systems change, we really need to think about a range of different societal sectors coming together. So that's where we need multi-stakeholder partnerships. And that's what we see in the second part of this model. So the supporter model involves providing funding and other kinds of support for a multi-stakeholder partnership. So for example, there's the P4G, Partnerships for Green Growth and the Global Goals, which is a funding mechanism that supports the creation of MSPs that involve private sector, non-profit and public sector. And as well as providing funding, they're also providing technical support and guidance, and crucially access to decision makers and high-level platforms to try and create a commercial viability and also have a regulatory influence. So trying to pull on those different levers for a system change. And then finally, we have perhaps the most ambitious approach, which is around the systems leadership. And this is about really championing a cause and putting the full weight of an organization's reputation and their resources over a long time frame around a certain cause, and somehow creating and supporting the infrastructure that allows collaboration to happen. So an example of this, and I'm hoping this might come up when our guest from J&J speaks, but the Centre for Health Worker Innovation by J&J has spearheaded a kind of ecosystem platform approach to bring together different partners and government to look at different ways of supporting community health workers in various country locations. So that's just one example, and a few other examples for those different models. And I think now it would be great to get you all talking to each other and maybe having a little bit.
This meeting is being recorded.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. Good to e-meet you all. I'm very excited to introduce you to Claire and Julie in a minute. So I'll be as brief as I can. So my job is just basically to describe this thing that we call a fit for partnering framework. Before I do that, I just wanted to share 2 poll results that you all very kindly answered questions before you signed up for this meeting about your capacities to collaborate, institutional, individual capacities to collaborate. This first poll shows that there's lots of answers in the positive. So you're either a very experienced group or you're very highly self-rating, or some mixture of those 2 ideas. Then if you go to the next poll, this is about the partners, grantees, investees. So it's a slightly more mixed picture here. So still quite a lot of positive ideas about partners and grantees having the right institutional capacities in place, but also there's a much bigger I don't know percentage there for 28%. Of course, how you answer that question depends on how you're defining the right institutional individual capacities for collaboration. So what I'm going to do now is define institutional capacities for collaboration, which is essentially our fit for partnering framework. So I'm going to whiz through this now. If you want to see the full framework, it's in the end of that report that Anna's already shared. This is based on a pretty standard organizational change framework, which we've overlaid with a partnering lens, and it's flexible enough to apply to any reasonably large organization. So we've worked with NGOs, as well as foundations, governments, companies to try and use this to help to strengthen their partnering capacity. So just very briefly on these 4 areas, strategy and leadership. So Anna's already talked about, does the organization have a clear partnering strategy in place? And we've suggested these 4 types of partnering strategy that apply particularly for foundations. The other element here is leadership. So in an organization that's fit for partnering, we'd expect to see the senior leadership really walking the collaborative talk. So it's not just a paper commitment, but there's actually partnering is enabled and incentivized through budget and resource allocation across the organization. The second area is management systems and processes. So what we tend to find is that by default, the systems and processes of most large organizations tend to be set up to protect the interests of the organization, as that's the default setting, rather than being set up to enable flexible and adaptable forms of working. So what we'd expect to see in a fit for partnering, an organisation that's fit for partnering, is really a really close review of everything from legal, financial, procurement, contracting, management information, even hiring and talent management and people HR systems, to check to the degree to which they enable collaborative, flexible ways of working, rather than protecting sort of the institution's interests. So for a foundation, that would include things like, as someone already mentioned, having flexible multi-year grant arrangements in the grant management system and being able to do that, or maybe having an understanding of risk that isn't just solely looking at investment risk or reputational risk, but is actually much more around the societal risk of not meeting your mission or your objectives. The next area is around staff skills and knowledge. So what we'd look for in an organisation that's fit for partnering is probably a specialist partnering support function. So someone who really knows how to put a design and implement and evaluate a partnership, as well as knowing how decisions get made internally within the organization. So those two things together. So knowing how one foundation operates, as well as knowing how to put a partnership together. We'd also look for a baseline of partnering skills across the whole organization. So everyone actually has a common language, a common shared language about what partnering is and what that means in practice. And then the final area is we'd expect to see partnering tools and guidance, so everyone knows how to what the approach is for how an organisation is going to go about partnering. So a standard approach to a partnering agreement, for example, or a review of how a partnership is working. So we use the language of health check reviews, for example. So that's one of the areas that we look for around tools and guidance. And then the final area is culture. So everything I've talked about so far is normally it's visible. You can see what a structure is, you can see what a system and process looks like, you can see what a strategy is, but obviously the culture is invisible. But it's actually, if the culture isn't right, as I'm sure you all know, everything else is very difficult to make it happen. So when a foundation is fully optimized for partnering, we look for evidence and behaviors of flexible, adaptive ways of working, a real commitment to learning and continuous improvement, including permission to fail, and also really authentically working from the belief that delivering the mission depends on the quality of relationships with its stakeholders and partners. So it's much easier said than done. There's a lot of talk about partnership and partnering, but actually demonstrating that in behavior is often a different thing. One final thing before I turn to Julie, if you want to see what it looks like when an organisation is really invested heavily in being fit for partnering, there's a really good case study of one of the largest NGOs, World Vision, and it shows the process that they've been through and shows how they've made changes and the benefits of taking this kind of approach. Okay, that's enough from me. If you can stop screen sharing, please. I'd love to turn to